Everyone thinks the biggest threat to their financial future is a market crash or a bad investment. They're wrong. I've spent my entire career telling people that the real danger, the one variable you can never truly account for, is family. I just never thought I'd be talking about my own. It was a lesson I was about to learn the hard way, one that would cost me more than money. My world was built on numbers, on predictable outcomes and carefully managed risk. As a financial planner at 38, my office on the outskirts of Chicago was a sanctuary of order. That afternoon, I was guiding the Millers, a young couple with stars in their eyes and fear in their hearts, through the labyrinth of their retirement plan. The power of compounding is your best friend, I explained, pointing to a graph that soared upwards. Time is the one asset you have in abundance right now. Don't waste it. They nodded, soaking it in. I saw the relief on their faces as chaos was translated into a clear, actionable plan. That was my gift. I could take a person's messy life, all their hopes and fears, and distill them into a spreadsheet. I could build a fortress of security around their future, and I was damn good at it. As they left, clutching their new folder like a holy text, I felt that familiar surge of satisfaction. I had brought order to their universe. Tonight, however, was about my own. Matt and I were celebrating. The email had arrived at 4:15 p.m., a single line of text that held the weight of our entire future. Mortgage approved. After years of scrimping, of packing our own lunches and driving a 10-year-old car, we'd done it. The house of our dreams, a beautiful Victorian with a wraparound porch in Oak Park, was finally ours. It was the culmination of every spreadsheet I'd ever made for us. To the blueprint, Matt said, raising his glass of champagne. At 39, my husband had a calm solidity that anchored me. He was a high school history teacher, a man who dealt in the grand narratives of the past, while I charted the precise coordinates of the future. To years of planning, saving, and you saying no to that ridiculously expensive trip to Bali. I laughed, the sound echoing in our small, tidy apartment that we would soon be leaving behind. It was a sound financial decision, I said, leaning in to kiss him. And now we have a yard for the dog we don't have yet, and a spare bedroom for the baby we haven't made yet. His smile was my favorite thing in the world. This was it. The peak. The moment when the plan comes together so perfectly it feels like magic. We had built our fortress, brick by meticulous brick. Then, the phone rang, its shrill sound slicing through the perfect evening. I glanced at the screen. Dad. A familiar, complicated knot tightened in my stomach, one I'd learned to ignore over the years. I answered, forcing cheerfulness into my voice. Hi, Dad. What's up? His voice on the other end was breezy, too breezy. That was always the first sign. Hey, Sarah Bear. Sorry to bother you on a weeknight. Listen, your mother and I got some papers from the bank. It's probably nothing, just some confusing legal stuff. You think you could swing by and take a quick look? I could hear my mother, Linda, in the background, her voice a faint murmur. My professional instincts kicked in immediately, overriding the champagne buzz. What kind of papers, Dad? Is it about the mortgage? An investment statement? My mind was already cycling through the possibilities, running diagnostics. No, nothing like that, he said quickly. Just, official looking. We just can't make heads or tails of it. I looked at Matt, who was watching me with a knowing, patient expression. He knew this dance. Okay, Dad. I sighed, the celebratory mood deflating like a punctured balloon. I'll come by tomorrow morning before work. He pushed a little more. Would tonight be possible? Your mother's just a little worked up. I closed my eyes. It was never just a quick look. It was never nothing. I hung up the phone after promising I'd be there in an hour, the champagne tasting flat on my tongue. I told myself it was nothing, but a planner always knows when an unscheduled variable has just been added to the equation. My parents' house was a monument to the American dream, baby boomer edition. A sprawling two-story colonial in a neighborhood where the lawns were manicured with surgical precision. It was the house I grew up in, a place that always smelled of lemon polish and my mother's expensive scented candles. But as I pulled into the driveway, I couldn't shake a feeling of profound unease. Have you ever entered a place that looks perfect on the surface but feels hollow inside? My mother, Linda, opened the door before I could ring the bell. Her smile stretched a little too tight. "Sarah, honey, thanks for coming on such short notice." My father, Robert, was standing behind her in the foyer, looking for all the world like the retired executive he was, except for the way he kept rubbing the back of his neck. "It's probably nothing," he said, leading me into the formal living room, a space so pristine I wasn't sure anyone had ever actually lived in it. He gestured to a single thin manila folder on the polished mahogany coffee table. "There it is. The bank sent it over. We just thought you'd understand the jargon better than we do." I picked it up, expecting to see a prospectus for a complex annuity or a detailed investment report. My mind was already in professional mode, ready to decipher yields and risk factors. I opened the folder. But there was no jargon. There were no investments. Inside was a stack of paper, held together by a paperclip. On top was a notice from a credit card company, the words "Final Notice" stamped across it in angry red ink. The amount due was over $5,000. Beneath it was another, from a different bank. Then another. And another. There were utility bills marked overdue, and a letter from their mortgage company written in language that was anything but confusing. It was the kind of mail I helped my most desperate clients sort through. "Dad, what is this?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. I spread the papers out on the table. They looked so vulgar and out of place on the gleaming wood. "This isn't an investment report. These are past due bills." My father cleared his throat. "Well, we got a little behind. You know how it is. Things cost more these days." My mother just nodded, twisting her hands together. "It takes 40 years to build a life, and about 5 minutes of looking at the right documents to see it was all an illusion." A cold dread began to seep into my bones. This wasn't a little behind. This was a symptom of a much larger disease. "I need to see everything," I said, my voice firm, the daughter suddenly replaced by the financial planner. "Every bank statement, every credit card bill, every loan document, your retirement accounts, everything. Right now." For a moment they looked like they might refuse, their faces a mixture of shame and defiance, but then my father sighed, a sound of complete surrender, and led me to his office. For the next 2 hours, I sat at his antique oak desk while they brought me box after box of financial documents. The story they told was catastrophic. It was a slow-motion car crash that had been happening for a decade. The credit cards, all 6 of them, were maxed out. The total wasn't just shocking, it was obscene. A 6-figure sum that made me physically nauseous. Their retirement account, the one they'd proudly told me was their nest egg for a golden future, was almost completely drained. But the final blow, the one that made me feel like the floor had dropped out from under me, was the house itself. I found the documents for a second mortgage, a home equity line of credit they had taken out 5 years ago, and bled dry. Their beautiful house, the symbol of their success and my stable childhood, wasn't an asset. It was a cage of debt. They owed more on it than it was worth. The facade hadn't just cracked. It had been pulverized, and all that was left was the dust of decades of lies. I sat there, in my father's impossibly neat office, and let the silence press in on me. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and the unspoken truth of a lifetime of financial mismanagement. The numbers on the pages before me didn't just represent debt, they were a testament to a fantasy, a story they had told themselves for decades, a story that had just reached its final ugly chapter. And they were looking at me, expecting me to write them a new one. They weren't looking for a financial planner, they were looking for a magician. I watched them as they watched me. My father, with his jaw set in a semblance of dignity, and my mother, whose eyes darted between my face and the damning evidence on the desk. They weren't ashamed of the mess. They were terrified of the consequences. And then, my mother smiled. It was a bright, brittle thing, a weapon against reality. "You know," she began, her voice imbued with a shocking lightness, "we've been doing a lot of thinking." "We have an idea," my father chimed in, leaning forward as if about to share a brilliant stock tip. "A brilliant plan, really. It solves everything." He looked at my mother, who took over, her voice gaining momentum. "We were thinking, you and Matt are looking for a bigger house anyway. You want a place with a yard for future grandchildren, right? And well, this house is getting to be a bit much for us to manage." She gestured vaguely at the perfect dust-free room around us. She took a deep breath, her smile widening. "So, here's the plan. What if you and Matt don't go through with your mortgage? You sell your little apartment, and we sell this house. We take all the money from all 3 sales and pool it together. We pay off these silly debts," she said, waving a dismissive hand at the pile of final notices. "And with what's left, we buy one big, beautiful new house, for all of us. One big family, together." Have you ever been told a secret so absurd that for a second, you question your own sanity? My mind, the one I used to build secure futures for my clients, was short-circuiting. The proposal was a financial nightmare, a conflagration of bad ideas. It was a violation of every principle I had ever espoused. Forget the loss of independence, the generational clash of lifestyles, the utter destruction of my own carefully laid plans. She was suggesting we merge our finances, shackling Matt and me to their 6-figure debt and a lifetime of propping up their choices. They weren't just asking for help. They were demanding a sacrifice, a total absorption of their failure into my success. My dream house, my future with Matt, our independence. It was all just collateral to be liquidated to save them from the life they had built. "We could help with the grandkids," my mother added, her eyes shining with the brilliance of her own idea. "And you could help look after us as we get older. It's perfect, isn't it?" I looked from her beaming face to my father's hopeful one. They weren't evil. They weren't even trying to be malicious. They were just boomers, from a generation that believed the line on the graph would only ever go up. They had created a fantasy of perpetual prosperity, and now that it had crumbled, they were trying to write me in as the magical ending. They saw my life not as my own, but as the final, unearned chapter of their own story. They saw a solution. I saw an inheritance clause written in blood. How do you explain to the architects of your entire world that their blueprints are fundamentally flawed? I took a breath, the air in the perfectly climate-controlled room feeling suddenly thin. My professional mind was screaming, running calculations on the sheer cataclysmic foolishness of their plan. It was financial suicide packaged as a Hallmark card. If any client had brought this to me, I would have gently but firmly dismantled it in under 5 minutes. But these weren't clients. They were my parents. "Mom, Dad," I began, forcing my voice into the calm, measured tone I used for panicked investors. "I understand what you're trying to do. You're looking for a simple solution, but combining our finances like this, it's incredibly risky. For all of us." I leaned forward, trying to draw them into my world of logic. We'd be tying my and Matt's entire financial future, our home, our retirement, everything we've worked for, to this existing debt. It doesn't eliminate the risk. It just spreads it. I saw the shutters coming down in their eyes. They didn't want a lecture. They wanted a savior. But I had to try. There are other options, I pressed on, my voice still gentle. Real solutions. We could put this house on the market immediately. Use the equity, what little there is, to pay down the highest interest credit cards. Then we find you a smaller place, a condo or a rental, something with manageable expenses. We create a strict budget. It would be hard, but it's a clean path forward. Their silence was a wall. And there's another tool, I said, knowing this would be the hardest part. It's not something to take lightly, but it exists for situations exactly like this. It's called bankruptcy. It's not a moral failure, it's a financial reset. It would be difficult, and your credit would be shot for a few years, but it would wipe the slate clean. It would give you a chance to actually start over, debt-free. I laid the options on the table like a surgeon presenting two difficult but life-saving procedures. My father was the first to speak, his voice laced with a deep, wounded pride. Bankruptcy? Sarah, we are not bankrupts. He said the word like it was a terminal disease. He looked at me as if I'd suggested they move into a cardboard box under a bridge. He wasn't hearing the logic of a financial tool. He was hearing the shame of public failure, the one thing their entire lives had been orchestrated to avoid. The facade was more important than the foundation. That's when my mother's expression changed from hopeful to hurt, a transformation that was both terrifying and brutally effective. I don't understand you, she said, her voice trembling slightly. We're your family. We gave you everything. We paid for the best schools, the piano lessons you quit after 6 months, the car you got for your 16th birthday. We did everything so you could have this wonderful life, this successful career. And now, the one time we need you, you're talking to us about bankruptcy? Her words were precision-guided missiles of guilt, each one hitting a target planted in my childhood. Was this what love was? A lifelong loan that could be called in at any moment? My rational mind knew this was emotional blackmail, a textbook case. But the part of me that was still their daughter, the part that craved their approval, felt the sting. It was a vicious, brilliant maneuver that shifted the argument from their irresponsible choices to my supposed lack of gratitude. My father nodded, seizing the new line of attack. Your mother is right. This isn't about spreadsheets and tools, Sarah. This is about family helping family. We're not asking for a handout. We're offering a solution where everyone wins. I looked at them, truly looked at them, and I finally understood. They didn't want a financial planner. They didn't want my expertise. They wanted me to be the final asset they could liquidate to cover their losses. The conversation was over before it began. I came here to fix a balance sheet. I was now being asked to pay a debt that wasn't on any ledger. I drove home in a daze, the pristine suburban streets blurring into a meaningless watercolor of green lawns and big houses. It felt like I had just walked out of a parallel universe where all the laws of finance and family had been inverted. My sanctuary, our small apartment, felt different when I walked in. It was a space Matt and I had built together, a testament to shared goals and mutual responsibility. Now, it felt fragile, like a sandcastle waiting for the tide. Matt was in the kitchen, packing leftovers for his lunch the next day. He looked up, and his smile faded the second he saw my face. That was more than just looking at some papers, wasn't it? I didn't say a word. I just walked over to the counter, took out the bottle of champagne we'd opened in what felt like another lifetime, and poured the flat remains down the sink. The gesture said more than words ever could. Then, standing in our kitchen, I told him everything. I laid it all out. The mountains of credit card debt, the drained retirement account, the second mortgage that had hollowed out their home. I described their brilliant plan in excruciating detail. The merging of our lives, the sacrifice of our dream house, the expectation that we would simply absorb their catastrophe. As I spoke, I watched his face shift from concern to disbelief, and then to a hard, protective anger that I loved him for. "Absolutely not," he said, the words sharp and final. "No way in hell, Sarah. That is insane." He came over and wrapped his arms around me, his embrace a solid wall against the chaos. "This is not your fault, and it is not your responsibility to sacrifice our entire future to fix their mistakes. They're adults. They made their choices." Hearing him say it, so clearly and without hesitation, was like a gulp of clean air after being trapped in a suffocating room. We were a team. We were on the same page. But the assault wasn't over. It had just changed tactics. The next evening, my mother called. I saw her name on the screen and my stomach clenched. The conversation was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. There were tears. She spoke of their sleepless nights, my father's heart condition that suddenly seemed much worse, and how they had always thought they could count on me. "I don't know where we went wrong with you, Sarah," she sobbed, "that you could be so cold." I ended the call shaking, a cocktail of guilt and rage coursing through me. Matt held my hand and told me to stay strong. The next day, she called again. This time, she talked about their friends, the Polks, whose children had bought them a condo in Florida. The subtext was clear. Other children were grateful. The day after that, she called and just cried, barely speaking a word. Each call was a fresh wave of guilt, designed to erode my defenses. And it started to work. Not on me, but on Matt. He saw what the calls were doing to me, how I'd flinch every time my phone rang. After the third call, he sat down next to me on the couch, his expression troubled. "This is killing you," he said softly. "I can't stand watching them do this to you." I nodded, grateful for his sympathy. But then he said the words that cracked our foundation. Maybe there's some kind of compromise we haven't thought of." I stared at him. "A compromise? Matt, what compromise? The one where we only give them half of our future? Where we buy them a house but get to keep our car?" My voice was sharper than I intended. He flinched. "I don't know," he said, frustrated. "But a clean no is going to tear your family apart. Don't you see that? I don't want to be the reason you never speak to your parents again." And there it was. He wasn't on my team anymore. He was a referee, trying to stop a fight. But in a fight like this, the referee is never on your side. The space between Matt and me was no longer measured in inches, but in the weight of unspoken tension. His question about a compromise echoed in every room of our small apartment, a ghost of doubt that undermined the foundation of our team. He didn't understand. How could you compromise with a hurricane? How could you negotiate with a forest fire? But he was my husband, and his pain was my own. I had to find a way to make him see. So, I went back. I drove to my parents' house when they were out, using the spare key they didn't know I still had. The house was silent, a perfect museum of a life that never really existed. I went straight to my father's office and pulled out the boxes of documents again. I wasn't looking for more debt. I was looking for an answer, a piece of leverage, a single fact that could cut through the fog of my mother's tears and my father's wounded pride. What do you look for when you suspect the hole is deeper than you've been shown? For hours, I sifted through the same depressing story. Statements showing years of spending $5,000 a month while earning $4,000. It was a slow, mundane bleed-out. But it didn't feel like the whole truth. There was a desperation to their plan that felt born of something more acute than just decades of overspending. I started looking not at the debt, but at the cash flow. I pulled out their bank statements from the last 5 years, spreading them across the floor, creating a timeline of their downfall. And then I saw it. An anomaly. A single transaction from 3 years ago. A wire transfer out of their checking account for $50,000. It was a clean, round number. There was no corresponding deposit into an investment account, no record of a car purchase or a home repair. It was just gone. A $50,000 ghost in their financial machine. My heart started to beat faster. This was it. This was the piece that didn't fit the narrative of simple, thoughtless excess. I tore through the rest of the boxes with a new, frantic energy. I was looking for anything from around that date in the spring of 2022, and I found it, tucked into a folder of old, expired car insurance policies. It was a single printed email. The subject line read, "Our venture." It was from my father to a man I vaguely knew, a friend from his old golf club. The email was full of breathless, optimistic jargon about a tech startup, a game-changing app that was a guaranteed 10-bagger. The email confirmed my father had invested the $50,000, borrowed from his friend as a private, undocumented loan. It was a gentleman's agreement, based on a handshake and a shared delusion of getting rich quick. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just mismanagement, this was a secret gamble. They hadn't just slid into debt, they had taken a blind leap of faith with borrowed money and crashed. They had lied, not just by omission, but actively, while they cried to me on the phone. The last flicker of my sympathy was extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard rage. I finally understood the truth. You can't save people who are determined to drown you with them. That single printed email changed everything. It wasn't just another bill or a statement. It was a Rosetta Stone for their behavior, translating their desperation into the clear language of deceit. The $50,000 secret loan wasn't just a poor investment, it was a betrayal. They had stood in their living room, painting a picture of themselves as hapless victims of circumstance, all while hiding the fact that they had actively gambled their security away on a handshake deal. I drove home with the email in my purse, a cold, hard piece of evidence. When I showed it to Matt, the ghost of compromise that had haunted our apartment for days finally vanished. He read it, then read it again, his face hardening with each word. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw the teammate I had been missing. "They lied to you," he said, his voice low and steady. "They lied to both of us." The chasm between us closed. We were a united front once more, and now we had a weapon. The time for gentle suggestions and tearful phone calls was over. They had mistaken my professional courtesy for weakness. Now they were going to get the professional. I spent the next 2 days in my office after hours, not as their daughter, but as their last resort financial planner. I ran their numbers, analyzed their assets and liabilities, and built 2 starkly realistic, non-negotiable scenarios. There would be no plan C involving the sacrifice of my life. There was only the truth. We called them and said we needed to talk, in person. We met on neutral ground, a sterile conference room at my office on a Saturday morning. I wanted them off their home turf, stripped of the props of their fantasy life. When they walked in, they looked smaller somehow, their usual breezy confidence replaced by a nervous uncertainty. They were expecting another round of emotional debate. They were not prepared for what I had waiting for them on the conference table. "Please, sit down," I said, my voice devoid of warmth. It was the same voice I used with clients who had been defrauding their business partners. Matt stood behind me, a silent, solid presence. In front of them, I laid out 2 neat folders, labeled Plan A and Plan B. "We're done talking about feelings," I began, my eyes meeting theirs without flinching. "We're done talking about what's fair or what you think you deserve. Today, We are only going to talk about math. And math doesn't care about your feelings. I open the first folder. Plan A, controlled liquidation. You call a realtor. I have a list of 3 reputable ones on Monday. You list the house for a price that will make it sell within 30 days. Every penny of the proceeds, after the mortgages are paid, goes to the highest interest credit cards first. I've already prepared a budget for you based on your Social Security income. You will rent a small 1-bedroom apartment. There will be no more club memberships, no more expensive dinners. This is the path to solvency. Then I push the second folder forward. Plan B, Chapter 7. Bankruptcy. You call a lawyer. I also have a list of 3 on Monday. You will likely lose the house. You will definitely destroy your credit for the next 7 to 10 years. But, in roughly 6 months, you will be legally free of all unsecured debt. It is a brutal, humiliating process, but it is a definitive end to the problem. I paused, letting the weight of the 2 options settle in the silent room. And just so we're all clear on why we are only discussing these 2 options, I continued, pulling the printed email from my bag and sliding it across the table. It's because of this. A $50,000 private loan for a failed startup that you conveniently forgot to mention. The color drained from my father's face. My mother stared at the paper as if it were a snake. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a near whisper. I will help you with Plan A, or I will help you with Plan B. But our involvement, my expertise, my time, and a single cent of our money, ends the moment you deviate from one of these 2 paths. This is not a negotiation. This is the ultimatum. You have until Monday to choose. For a long moment, the only sound in the sterile conference room was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The 2 folders sat between us on the polished table, inert objects that held the full weight of their future. I watched my parents' faces as they processed the ultimatum. Shock was the first wave, a wide-eyed disbelief. Then came the second wave, the one I had been bracing for. A deep, profound, volcanic rage. This wasn't the anger of people who were being helped. It was the fury of a king and queen being told their reign was over. My father was the first to move. He didn't open the folders. He pushed them away with the back of his hand, a gesture of complete and utter contempt. His eyes, when they met mine, were filled with a look of such profound betrayal that it almost knocked the air from my lungs. "So this is it," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "This is what it comes to. You bring us into your cold, empty office to lecture us like we're children who've overspent our allowance." He stood up then, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. The controlled executive was gone, replaced by a wounded animal. "You want to throw us out on the street?" he roared, his voice bouncing off the glass walls. The accusation hung in the air, a grotesque distortion of my carefully constructed plans. "You want to humiliate us, force us into some tiny, miserable apartment while you and your husband move into your perfect dream house. You want us to declare bankruptcy, to have our names dragged through the mud? Is that the price of your help?" My mother, who had been silent and pale, found her voice. It was not the tearful, manipulative whisper she used on the phone. It was sharp and venomous. "I knew you had a cold streak, Sarah," she hissed, rising to stand beside my father, a united front of indignation. "But I never imagined you could be this cruel. This is our home, the home we raised you in. And you talk about selling it like it's just an asset on a spreadsheet. There is no love in you, only numbers." They saw the plans not as a lifeline, but as a cage. It was a cage of reality, and they would rather burn with their ship than be rescued and forced to live on a smaller, more sensible island. "We don't want your help," my father spat, grabbing his jacket. "We don't need your ultimatums. We will find another way." It was a hollow, desperate boast, but he said it with the last ounce of his pride. They turned and walked out of the room, not just leaving the folders, but leaving me. The heavy glass door swung shut behind them, the soft click echoing like a gunshot. Matt's hand came to rest on my shoulder, a warm, grounding pressure in the sudden, deafening silence. I stared at the two folders they had abandoned on the table, the neat, logical solutions to an illogical problem. The professional in me felt a grim satisfaction. The boundary had been set and held. But the daughter, the part of me that was still a little girl, felt like she had just been orphaned. I had presented them with a choice, and they had chosen their pride over their daughter. As the silence stretched, a strange and terrifying new feeling began to surface, pushing its way up through the layers of devastation and the thick, choking tar of guilt. It was relief, a clean, sharp, and utterly brutal sense of relief. The endless phone calls were over. The emotional blackmail had reached its limit. The weight of their expectations, a burden I had carried my entire life, had finally been lifted because they had chosen to walk away from it. I had lost my parents, but I might have just gotten my life back. The weeks leading up to the closing were a strange, silent limbo. My phone, once a source of constant anxiety, had become an inert block of glass and metal. There were no tearful calls from my mother, no angry texts from my father. They had vanished from my life as completely as if they had never existed. It was a silence so profound it felt louder than their accusations. Every day it screamed the same message: "You are no longer our daughter." Now, sitting in the sterile, air-conditioned office of the title company, the silence felt concentrated in the room. In front of Matt and me sat a mountain of paper, a forest of legal clauses and financial disclosures that represented the final step. Our realtor, a cheerful woman named Janice, chattered on about escrow and property taxes, her voice a meaningless buzz in the background. My own phone was face down on the table next to my water bottle, a silent black mirror reflecting nothing. I found my mind drifting, picturing the wraparound porch on our new house, the big oak tree in the backyard that would be perfect for a swing someday. This was the culmination of a decade of discipline, of every bonus banked and every vacation deferred. This was our victory. But the joy I expected to feel was hollowed out by a persistent, grinding grief. With every page Janice slid in front of me for a signature, I felt like I wasn't just signing a mortgage. I was signing a formal declaration of severance from my past. "Just a few more here, Sarah." Janice's voice pulled me back. I looked at the line waiting for my signature. My hand felt strangely heavy, the pen a foreign object in my grip. I glanced at Matt. He met my gaze and slid his hand over mine on the table, his touch warm and firm. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His eyes said, "I am your family now. We are your family." He was the future I was choosing, the one we had built together, spreadsheet by spreadsheet. I took a deep breath, picked up the pen, and signed my name. The ink flowed onto the page, a dark, permanent line. It wasn't the neat, confident script of a financial planner. It was the shaky, determined scrawl of a survivor. I pushed the signed page back to Janice. My phone remained silent. No one called to congratulate me. No one called to scream at me. The silence was my answer, and my signature was mine. We were moving forward, and I was leaving them behind, buried under a mountain of their own pride. The first 3 weeks in the new house were a lesson in the physics of a new life. We learned that the echo in an empty room sounds like possibility. We learned that the smell of fresh paint can cover the scent of old wounds, at least for a while. Matt and I fell into a rhythm of unpacking boxes, assembling furniture, and making the 1,000 tiny decisions that turn a structure of wood and plaster into a home. It was a deliberate, joyful process of creation, and every box we emptied felt like a stone being pulled from my chest. We were building our fortress, just as we'd planned. But I was learning that even the strongest fortress has windows, and sometimes the past finds a way to look in. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. I was on a stepladder, taping the edges of the living room wall, when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. It was my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, a woman who usually only called on holidays and birthdays. A call out of the blue from her was like a storm siren on a clear day. It only ever meant bad news. "Sarah, honey, I was starting to think you'd fallen off the face of the earth." Her voice was a mixture of forced cheer and undisguised curiosity. "Your mother said you've been terribly busy." I knew this was a test, a probe to see what I would say. I kept my voice neutral. "We've been busy moving, Carol. You know how it is." She didn't buy it. "Well, I imagine your parents have been busy too, with their own move," she said, and the hook was set. I knew this was why she had called. I came down from the ladder and walked over to the bay window that overlooked our new green yard. "What do you mean, their own move?" I asked, my voice steady. And then she told me. She told me everything, in a long, rambling story filled with secondhand details and her own dramatic flourishes. My parents had never found another way. Their desperate boast had been nothing more than hot air. The bank hadn't been bluffing. The foreclosure notices had started arriving just a week after our meeting. Faced with the public humiliation of a sheriff's auction on their front lawn, they had panicked. They hadn't called one of the realtors I recommended. They had called the first "we buy houses for cash" number they saw on a telephone pole. They sold it in a hurry, for a rock-bottom price that was tens of thousands less than it was worth. They had just enough time to pack a few boxes before they had to be out. They had been forced to face reality, but on the worst possible terms, stripped of dignity, control, and any remaining equity. After I hung up, I stood at the window for a long time, watching a squirrel chase an acorn across the lawn. There was no triumph in me. There was only a vast gray emptiness. My plan A would have saved their dignity and some of their money. My plan B would have saved their future. They had chosen their own plan, Plan P for pride, and it had cost them everything. I had given them a map out of the wilderness, and they had chosen to set it on fire and stumble into the dark. And I finally, truly understood. I hadn't destroyed my family. They had. Life began to settle into the shape of our new house. The echoes faded, replaced by the mundane, beautiful sounds of a shared life. The coffee maker gurgling in the morning, Matt's voice on the phone with a student, the gentle hum of the dishwasher at night. We painted the living room a soft, calming gray. We planted hydrangeas along the front walk. We were putting down roots, consciously and deliberately, in the soil of the future we had chosen. The silence from my parents continued, a quiet hum of absence beneath the surface of our new life. Then, one evening, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, a local area code I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was a spam call. But something made me answer. "Hello?" I said, my voice cautious. There was a pause on the other end, a moment of static-filled hesitation. And then, a voice I knew as well as my own, but stripped of all its usual booming confidence. "Sarah Bear?" It was my father. He sounded small, like his voice was coming from a great distance. My hand tightened on the phone. My heart, which had been beating at a calm domestic rhythm, suddenly kicked into a gallop. "Dad?" I said, the single word a question, an accusation, and a statement of fact all at once. Matt, who was reading on the other side of the couch, looked up, his eyes immediately alert. "Yeah, it's me," my father said. He cleared his throat. Listen, I know it's been a while. We, we got a new place. Your mother and me. A small apartment over in Elmhurst. He was stumbling over the words, each one an admission of the reality he had fought so hard to deny. He wasn't calling to yell or to blame me. The fight was gone. The pride that had fueled his rage in my conference room had been burned away, leaving behind something raw and unfamiliar. The thing is, he continued, and I could hear the profound effort it was costing him, we've got all this paperwork, and we're trying to figure out a budget. You know, with just the Social Security. And I was wondering if you might have some time to help us sort it out. It wasn't an apology. The words, I'm sorry, or you were right, were not in his vocabulary. But in the space between his words, in the hesitant, humbled cadence of his voice, was a concession more powerful than any apology could ever be. He was asking for my help, not as a daughter who owed him a debt, but as an expert whose advice he now desperately needed. He was acknowledging, in his own broken way, that his map had led him off a cliff, and he was finally asking to see mine. I looked across the room at Matt, who was watching me, his expression unreadable. I thought of the two folders I had presented to them, Plan A and Plan B. This was their own version, Plan Z, enacted under duress and on the worst possible terms. But it was a plan, a first step. I could have said no. I could have told him that he had made his choice in that conference room and that the consequences were his alone to bear. But as I listened to the hollowed-out sound of his voice, I realized this wasn't about winning. It was about what comes after the war is over. Okay, Dad, I said, my own voice surprisingly steady. I can help with that. I drove to Elmhurst the following Saturday. The address my father had given me led to a sprawling, nondescript apartment complex, one of those places with beige siding and identical balconies. It was a world away from the manicured lawns and stately colonials of their old life. Finding their apartment, number 3B, felt like tracking down witnesses in a protection program. I stood outside the door for a moment, taking a breath, reminding myself of the new rules. I was not here as a daughter. I was here as a consultant. My mother opened the door. She looked smaller, diminished by the loss of her grand house and the curated life within it. The expensive silk blouse she wore looked out of place against the backdrop of cardboard boxes and cheap particle board furniture. Her smile was a fragile, trembling thing. Sarah, come in. The apartment was clean but cramped, filled with the ghosts of their former life. A massive, ornate grandfather clock stood awkwardly in a corner, its pendulum still, its chimes silenced. It was a relic from a kingdom that had fallen. My father was at the small kitchen table, a pile of envelopes and papers spread before him. He didn't stand up, but he met my eyes, and in his gaze I saw the full scope of their defeat. They were scared. The bravado and indignation were gone, replaced by the quiet terror of two people who had run out of road. Thanks for coming, he mumbled, gesturing to the chair opposite him. I didn't hug them. I didn't offer words of comfort. I simply sat down, took my laptop out of my bag, and opened it. Okay, I began, my voice crisp and professional. Let's start with income. What is the exact amount of your combined Social Security benefits each month? They looked at each other, then my father shuffled through the papers and told me the number. I typed it into a spreadsheet. Now, expenses. I need everything. Rent, utilities, car insurance, groceries, medications. Don't estimate. I want to see the actual bills. For the next hour, we worked. I was no longer their child caught in a storm of their making. I was a navigator charting a safe course through treacherous waters. There was no talk of blame or of the past. We only talked about numbers. I showed them how to categorize their spending, how to set up automatic bill payments, how to allocate a small fixed amount for discretionary spending. I was patient but firm. When my mother lamented that there was no room in the budget for her weekly salon appointment, I didn't argue. I just pointed to the numbers on the screen. "The math doesn't allow for it," I said simply. It wasn't a judgment. It was a fact. As I packed up my laptop, a new dynamic had settled in the small room. It wasn't warmth, and it wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. It was respect. They were looking at me not as the daughter who had betrayed them, but as the professional who knew how to fix things. I was no longer the good daughter who would sacrifice her own life for their comfort. I was the adult woman who had established a boundary of solid steel. I was helping them, but on my terms, within the lines I had drawn. I was their consultant, not their savior. And for the first time in our lives, our relationship was finally based on reality. A year later, the loudest sound in our house is the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It's not the ornate, oversized relic from my parents' fallen kingdom, but a simple, elegant one Matt and I found in an antique shop. It keeps steady, predictable time. It marks the passing of a life that is, for the first time, truly and completely our own. A life that is about to expand by one. They say you can't choose your family. Maybe not. But I've learned you can choose the terms of engagement. My parents come for dinner on the first Sunday of every month. Not every Sunday, which would be an intrusion, but once a month, which is an arrangement. My mother brings a store-bought pie and comments on my hydrangeas. My father talks to Matt about baseball and the weather. They are polite, contained guests in the house that was once the source of our war. Our conversations are a carefully curated landscape of safe topics. We don't talk about their old house or their new, cramped apartment. We don't talk about their finances, except when my father proudly mentions that he's sticking to the budget, a small, weekly victory he needs me to acknowledge. There are no tears, no guilt, no veiled requests for money. The emotional blackmail has ceased, not because they've become different people, but because they tried it on a locked door for so long they finally gave up and walked away. The change wasn't sudden. It was a slow, glacial shift, carved out by my consistency. My no was not a single event, but a permanent state of being. My help remained within the professional lines I had drawn. I was the consultant, available for scheduled appointments about budgets, not the 24/7 emotional support hotline. They had to learn to live with the consequences of their choices, and in the harsh light of that reality, they were forced, finally, to grow up. Our relationship is not easy, but it is stable, built on the solid, unglamorous foundation of reality. Tonight, after they've left, I stand in the room that will be the nursery, one hand resting on the gentle curve of my stomach where my son is kicking. The moonlight streams through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I think about the toxic inheritance they tried to pass down to me, a legacy of blurred lines, of love measured in obligation, of a fantasy built on a mountain of debt. I think about the fight I had to wage to refuse it. I look at the future we've built, this quiet, stable, solvent house, and I realize the truth. When I drew that line in the sand a year ago, I wasn't just defending my marriage or my home. I was defending this tiny, unborn person. I was breaking a cycle. I was refusing to let the ghosts of my parents' past haunt my child's future. I was writing a new inheritance clause, one that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with freedom.